Behind the carefully constructed facade of emotional stability and self-sufficiency, avoidants are often complete emotional disasters who have simply learned to hide their chaos better than other attachment styles. Their composed exterior and claims of independence mask an internal world characterized by profound emotional dysregulation, chronic anxiety, and complete inability to process feelings in healthy ways. The very strategies they use to appear emotionally stable, suppression, compartmentalization, and avoidance, actually create more emotional turbulence and psychological distress than they prevent. The avoidance emotional mess isn't immediately visible because they've spent years perfecting the art of emotional concealment and have built their entire identity around appearing unaffected by circumstances that would visibly distress other people. They've learned to internalize their emotional chaos rather than express it, creating internal pressure cookers that occasionally explode in unexpected ways or manifest through physical symptoms, addictive behaviors, or sudden relationship sabotage that seems to come out of nowhere. What makes avoidance particularly messy emotionally is that their suppression and avoidance strategies prevent them from developing healthy emotional processing skills that other people learn through trial and error. They never learn to identify, express, or work through emotions in constructive ways, leaving them perpetually overwhelmed by feelings they can't name, understand, or manage effectively. Their emotional immaturity often rivals that of much younger individuals because they've avoided the developmental work necessary for emotional growth and regulation, the facade of emotional stability. The avoidant has mastered the performance of emotional stability while experiencing internal chaos that would be obvious if they possessed the emotional literacy to recognize and express it. They present themselves as calm, rational, and unaffected by relationship dynamics or life stresses that visibly impact other people. But this presentation requires enormous energy and creates significant internal strain that eventually manifests in destructive ways. Their facade involves carefully controlling their external emotional expression, while their internal experience remains completely unregulated and chaotic. They may appear serene during conflict, while internally experiencing rage, panic, or overwhelming anxiety. They might seem indifferent to relationship problems, while internally obsessing about every interaction and feeling completely out of control. This disconnect between internal experience and external presentation creates additional stress and prevents them from receiving appropriate support for their actual emotional state. The emotional stability performance also requires constant vigilance and energy that leaves them depleted and more vulnerable to emotional overwhelm when their defenses are down. They can maintain their composed exterior during work hours or social situations, but may completely fall apart in private, experiencing emotional meltdowns that seem disproportionate to external circumstances, but actually represent the accumulated stress of constant emotional suppression. This facade becomes so convincing that even the avoidants themselves begin to believe they're actually emotionally stable, rather than recognizing their presentation as a sophisticated defense mechanism. They mistake their ability to suppress emotional expression for emotional regulation, their avoidance of difficult feelings for emotional strength, their numbness for peace. This self-deception prevents them from seeking help or developing genuine emotional skills. The performance of stability also creates expectations from others that the avoidant can handle anything without support, that they don't need emotional care or consideration, that they're strong enough to manage whatever life throws at them. These expectations become additional pressure that compounds their internal emotional chaos while preventing them from receiving the support they desperately need but can't ask for. Internal emotional chaos. Beneath their controlled exterior, avoidants typically experience constant emotional turbulence that they lack the skills to understand or manage effectively. Their internal world is often characterized by anxiety about relationships, fear of abandonment disguised as fear of commitment, rage about past hurts they've never processed, and profound loneliness that contradicts their claims of preferring solitude. These emotions swirl together in confusion because they've never learned to differentiate between different feelings or understand their origins and meanings. The avoidance emotional chaos often manifests as a constant state of low-level anxiety that they may not even recognize as anxiety because it's become their baseline experience. They feel perpetually on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop, hypervigilant about potential threats to their independence or emotional safety. This chronic stress state affects their physical health, sleep patterns, and ability to enjoy life, but they often attribute these symptoms to external circumstances rather than their emotional suppression. Their internal experience also includes conflicting emotions about relationships and intimacy that create constant psychological tension. They simultaneously crave connection and fear it, want to be understood while working to remain mysterious, desire support while insisting on independence. These contradictions create internal pressure that they can't resolve because doing so would require acknowledging their genuine emotional needs and vulnerabilities. The avoidant often experiences emotional flashbacks and triggers related to past attachment trauma that they don't recognize or understand. They may have sudden, intense reactions to situations that remind them unconsciously of childhood experiences. But because they've disconnected from their emotional responses, they can't identify why they're reacting or what they're actually feeling. This leads to emotional responses that seem irrational or disproportionate even to themselves. Their emotional chaos also includes profound grief about relationships they've lost or sabotage that they've never allowed themselves to process. They carry accumulated sadness, regret, and loss that compounds over time because they move on from situations without processing their emotional impact. This unprocessed grief affects their capacity for future relationships and contributes to their overall emotional instability, the inability to process emotions. Perhaps the most significant aspect of the avoidance emotional mess is their complete lack of emotional processing skills that other people develop naturally through life experience. They never learn to identify what they're feeling, understand why they're feeling it, express emotions appropriately, or work through difficult feelings to resolution. This leaves them perpetually overwhelmed by emotions they can't understand or manage. Their emotional processing typically involves either complete suppression or explosive release with no middle ground of healthy expression and regulation. They either feel nothing or feel everything at once, either appear completely unaffected or have dramatic meltdowns that seem to come from nowhere. This all-or-nothing approach to emotions creates instability and unpredictability that affects every area of their lives. The avoidant often can't distinguish between different emotions, experiencing everything as either good or bad, comfortable or uncomfortable, manageable or overwhelming. They lack the emotional vocabulary to describe complex feelings or the awareness to understand how different emotions can coexist or evolve over time. This emotional illiteracy makes it impossible for them to communicate their needs or work through relationship difficulties effectively. Their inability to process emotions also means they can't learn from emotional experiences or develop greater emotional wisdom over time. Each emotional challenge feels completely new and overwhelming because they haven't developed patterns for understanding and managing feelings. They repeat the same emotional mistakes because they never process what went wrong or how they might handle similar situations differently in the future. The avoidant also struggles with emotional timing, often having delayed reactions to situations that should produce immediate emotional responses. They might seem fine during a breakup, but fall apart weeks later, appear unaffected by conflict, but have anxiety attacks days afterward, or seem indifferent to loss, but experience depression months later when the reality finally penetrates their defenses. Physical and behavioral manifestations. The avoidance emotional mess often manifests through physical symptoms and destructive behaviors because their suppressed emotions need outlets that they're not providing through healthy expression and processing. They may experience chronic headaches, digestive issues, sleep problems, or unexplained fatigue that actually stem from the physical toll of emotional suppression rather than medical conditions. Their emotional chaos frequently emerges through addictive behaviors that provide temporary relief from their internal distress. This might include workaholism, substance abuse, compulsive shopping, sexual addiction, or other behaviors that offer distraction from feelings they can't face directly. These behaviors often seem inconsistent with their controlled presentation, but actually represent attempts to manage emotions they don't know how to process. The avoidant may also engage in self-sabotaging behaviors that seem illogical, but actually serve the function of creating external chaos that matches their internal emotional state. They might quit jobs suddenly, end relationships abruptly, move frequently, or make dramatic life changes that create crisis and disruption. These behaviors provide external explanations for their internal distress while avoiding the need to confront their actual emotional issues. Their emotional mess also manifests through relationship patterns that seem contradictory and confusing. They might pursue someone intensely, then withdraw completely, express love, then act indifferent, make commitments, then sabotage them. These patterns reflect their internal emotional confusion and their inability to maintain emotional consistency over time. The avoidant often experiences emotional overwhelm that appears as irritability, criticism, or sudden anger that seems disproportionate to the situation. They may snap at loved ones over minor issues, become unreasonably critical of partners, or have explosive reactions to small problems because they're actually responding to accumulated emotional pressure rather than the immediate trigger, the anxiety beneath the independence. Despite their claims of preferring solitude and independence, avoidants are often riddled with anxiety about relationships, abandonment, and their own emotional adequacy. Their independence is frequently a defense against anxiety rather than a genuine preference. And this underlying anxiety affects every aspect of their lives and relationships in ways they rarely acknowledge or understand. Their relationship anxiety often manifests as hypervigilance about their partner's moods, behaviors, and potential signs of dissatisfaction or departure. They may obsess about text message timing, analyze conversations for hidden meanings, or catastrophize about normal relationship challenges. This anxiety contradicts their claims of emotional detachment and reveals how much relationships actually matter to them, despite their protests otherwise. The avoidant experiences profound anxiety about their own emotional adequacy and their ability to meet others' needs or expectations. They worry constantly about disappointing people, being seen as inadequate, or being rejected for their limitations. This anxiety drives much of their defensive behavior and their tendency to withdraw before others can discover their perceived flaws or shortcomings. Their independence anxiety includes fear that they can't actually survive on their own, despite their claims of self-sufficiency. They may worry about their ability to handle life challenges alone, their capacity to make good decisions without input, or their worthiness of love and support when they do need help. This anxiety about their independence creates pressure to maintain their facade, even when it's harmful to their well-being. The avoidant also experiences anticipatory anxiety about future emotional demands or relationship expectations that might exceed their capacity. They worry about being trapped in situations they can't handle, being required to provide emotional support they can't give, or being expected to be vulnerable in ways that feel impossible. This anxiety often drives their preemptive withdrawal from relationships that are actually going well. The fear driving all behavior. At the core of the avoidance emotional mess lies profound fear that drives almost all of their relationship behaviors and life choices. This fear is often so deep and pervasive that they don't recognize it as fear, instead experiencing it as rational preferences for independence, logical assessments of relationship risks, or practical decisions about emotional investment. Understanding their behavior as fear-driven rather than preference-driven reveals the true extent of their emotional distress. Their primary fear involves being emotionally overwhelmed or consumed by feelings they can't control or understand. They fear that allowing themselves to feel deeply will lead to complete emotional collapse. That vulnerability will result in unbearable pain. That attachment will lead to devastating loss. This fear of their own emotional responses drives their suppression and avoidance strategies that actually create more emotional chaos. The avoidant fears being truly known by others because they believe that authentic knowledge of their internal experience would lead to rejection, judgment, or abandonment. They fear that their emotional neediness, insecurity, and chaos would be unacceptable to others if revealed, so they maintain facades that prevent genuine intimacy while simultaneously craving the acceptance they believe is impossible. They also fear losing control of their carefully constructed identity and the independence that protects them from emotional vulnerability. They fear that allowing themselves to need others will lead to dependence they can't escape, that commitment will trap them in situations they can't tolerate, that love will require them to give more than they're capable of providing. The avoidance fear extends to being responsible for others' emotional well-being and potentially causing harm through their own limitations. They fear that their emotional inadequacy will damage people they care about, that their inability to provide consistent emotional support will create suffering, that their tendency to withdraw will cause abandonment trauma in others. The loneliness they won't admit, despite their claims of preferring solitude and their apparent comfort with independence. Avoidants often experience profound loneliness that they can't acknowledge without threatening their entire identity structure. This loneliness isn't just about lacking social connection, but about feeling fundamentally unknown and unaccepted by others, isolated by their own defensive strategies that prevent genuine intimacy. Their loneliness includes the isolation that comes from constantly performing emotional stability while experiencing internal chaos. They feel alone with their struggles because they can't share their actual emotional experience without revealing the vulnerability they've spent so much energy hiding. This creates a sense of being surrounded by people who don't really know them and couldn't help them if they did. The avoidant experiences existential loneliness that comes from feeling disconnected from their own authentic self. They've spent so much time suppressing and avoiding their genuine emotions that they often don't know who they really are beneath their defensive presentations. This disconnection from self creates loneliness that can't be filled by external relationships because the relationship with themselves is missing. Their loneliness also includes grief about connections they've lost or sabotaged through their defensive behaviors. They recognize, often unconsciously, that their patterns prevent them from maintaining the relationships they actually want and need. This creates a sense of being responsible for their own isolation, while feeling powerless to change the patterns that create it. The avoidant often experiences the loneliness of feeling misunderstood by others who see their defensive behaviors as choices, rather than compulsions driven by fear and trauma. They feel judged for their emotional limitations while being unable to explain or change them, creating isolation that feels both deserved and unbearable. The desperate need for help they can't ask for. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the avoidance emotional mess is their desperate need for emotional support, understanding, and help developing healthier relationship skills while being completely unable to ask for or accept this help. Their defensive strategies that were designed to protect them from emotional harm actually prevent them from receiving the support that could heal their underlying wounds and improve their emotional functioning. Their need for help includes requiring assistance with basic emotional literacy, learning to identify, understand, and express feelings in healthy ways. They need help developing emotional regulation skills that allow them to experience feelings without being overwhelmed by them. They need support processing past trauma that continues to affect their current relationships and life choices. The avoidant desperately needs help understanding that their emotional needs are normal and acceptable, that vulnerability can be safe in the right relationships, that interdependence can coexist with independence. They need models of healthy emotional expression and relationship dynamics that contradict their learned beliefs about the dangers of emotional connection. They also need help recognizing that their defensive strategies, while protective, are actually creating more suffering than they prevent. They need support in gradually lowering their defenses and experimenting with greater emotional openness in safe relationships. This requires patience and understanding from others that they often don't receive because their defensive behaviors push away the very people who might be able to help them. The avoidant's inability to ask for help stems from their fear that needing support proves their inadequacy, that asking for help will lead to judgment or rejection, that their emotional needs are burdensome to others. This creates a tragic cycle where their greatest need for emotional connection and support is prevented by the very fears and defenses that make them need it so desperately. The path to emotional health. Recognizing avoidance as emotional messes, rather than emotionally stable individuals, is the first step toward understanding what they actually need for healing and growth. Their path to emotional health requires acknowledging their emotional chaos, rather than maintaining facades of stability, developing basic emotional literacy skills they never learned, and gradually learning to tolerate and express vulnerability in safe relationships. The healing process involves learning to identify and name emotions as they occur, rather than suppressing or avoiding them. This requires developing mindfulness and self-awareness skills that allow them to notice their internal experience without immediately defending against it. It involves learning that emotions are information rather than threats, temporary experiences rather than permanent states. Emotional health for avoidance also requires processing accumulated trauma and grief that they've avoided dealing with throughout their lives. This might involve therapy, support groups, or other healing modalities that provide safe spaces for emotional expression and processing. The goal isn't to become emotionally expressive overnight, but to develop capacity for healthy emotional experience and expression over time. The path also includes learning to ask for and accept emotional support from others, recognizing that interdependence is strength rather than weakness. That vulnerability can lead to deeper connection rather than rejection. This requires gradually taking risks with emotional openness and learning that the right people will respond with understanding and acceptance rather than judgment or abandonment. Ultimately, the avoidance emotional mess represents both their greatest challenge and their greatest opportunity for growth. Acknowledging their emotional chaos honestly allows them to begin developing the skills and relationships necessary for genuine emotional health and satisfaction. The very emotions they've been avoiding contain the information and energy they need to create more fulfilling lives and relationships. Understanding avoidance as emotional messes rather than emotionally stable individuals also helps their partners and loved ones respond with appropriate expectations and boundaries. It reveals that their defensive behaviors stem from emotional distress rather than calculated manipulation, while also making clear that their emotional chaos doesn't excuse harmful behavior or obligate others to accept poor treatment. This understanding can guide more effective responses that support genuine healing while protecting everyone involved from continued emotional harm.